Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about intervals, what they are and how to identify them. So in music, an interval measures the distance between two notes, and we have two types of intervals, what are called generic intervals and specific intervals. Generic intervals are just a numerical measurement. An interval becomes a specific measurement when it includes what we call a quality. And we'll talk about that in a second. So first, how to measure generic intervals? You see I have a few here on the screen. If you count the bottom note as 1 and count until you get to the top note, that will give you the generic measurement. So this first example here, F to C. If I count F as 1, that means G would be 2, A would be 3, B would be 4, C would be 5. So the generic measurement is 5, but the way we express that is to say this is the interval of a fifth. It's really important that you remember to count the bottom note as 1 and not to count from the bottom note to the next note as 1. It's not from the bottom note 1. Count the bottom note as 1 and then count up from there. The next one, G to B. Counting G as 1, A would be 2, B would be 3. This is the interval of a third. I should mention that when we're talking about generic intervals, that is just the numeric measurement, accidentals, sharps and flats, have no bearing on the generic measurement. It's strictly a measure of their location on the staff, or even you can just count on your hands from one letter to the next, counting the bottom note as 1. So for this example, I could count from E up to D, ignoring that it was E flat, not caring that it's E flat. E, F, G, A, B, C, D. I get 7. So this is the interval of a seventh. Okay, if you want to try one, pause and try 1, 2, and 3, then we can go over them after that. Okay, so number 1, F sharp to B, counting F sharp as 1 gives us generically a fourth. From A flat to B flat is going to give us a second. And from G flat to E flat is going to give us a sixth. You probably notice that seconds are always going to be next to each other, adjacent notes, line space or space line. Thirds are always going to be line to line or space to space. Okay, I want to talk about two particular instances now. When two notes occupy the same line or space on the staff, they are called a unison. Or you could call it a first, or you could call it a prime. When two notes occupy the same line or space, they are a unison. Again, I could put any accidentals I want on this and it would still be a unison because it's still some kind of D next to some kind of D. So the measurement is 1. The measurement is a unison. Likewise, what we have here, G to G, is what we call an octave, which is written like eighth. You could say eighth, but mostly we'll be saying octave for that. Okay, so just want to draw your attention to those. Now, again, accidentals have no bearing on this. I could throw a handful of accidentals on the screen right now, and none of the answers that I wrote about the generic measurement would change. It would still be fifth, third, seventh, fourth, second, sixth, unison, octave, even if I added a whole bunch of accidentals. It's an important point to make. Okay, let's start talking about interval quality. And the way that we're going to do that is we are going to measure the intervals of the major scale. So if you look here in the key of F, I took all the notes in F major and wrote out the intervals. So I have F to F, F to G, F to A, from F to each subsequent note of its major scale. It's a good way to talk about the different qualities and measurements. So generically, this is pretty easy right now. This is a unison, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, or an eighth, or an octave. Now, when we're taking generic measurements, you count from the bottom up to the top. Now, thinking about quality. If you measure an interval and the top note is a member of the bottom note's scale, all of these fit that bill, right? Because we wrote from F major. If the top note is a member of the bottom note's major scale, it could be one of two qualities. And those qualities are perfect and major. Perfect and major are the two qualities that apply when in an interval, the top note is a member of the bottom note's major scale. So Intervals that are perfect in the major scale are unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. If you encounter a unison, a fourth, a fifth, or an octave where the top note is a member of the bottom note's major scale, its quality is called perfect. If you encounter a second, a third, a sixth, or a seventh where the top note is a member of the bottom note's major scale, that quality is called major. And that's how you would write them. So that means the intervals of the major scale are a perfect unison, a major second, a major third, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a major sixth, a major seventh, and a perfect octave. So when you're trying to identify an interval, first take its generic measurement. That means produce the number, counting the lower note as 1, counting up to the higher note. Then ask yourself, is the top note a member of the bottom note's major scale? If the answer is yes, and it's a unison, a fourth, a fifth, or an octave, the quality of that interval will be perfect. If the top note is a member of the bottom note's major scale, and the interval you're talking about is a second, third, sixth, or seventh, its quality will be major. Those are the first two qualities, perfect and major. When we identify an interval, check to see if it's perfect or major first. Okay, now let's start talking about what happens if I have notes that don't belong to the major scale, or if I start doing things to perfect and major intervals. So let's take, I don't know, this major third and rewrite it over here. Okay, so major third. If I lower the top note of a major interval by a half step, then it becomes a minor interval. I encourage my students to write lowercase m with the horizontal line over it so I can tell the difference between your upper and lowercase m's. If a major interval has its top note lowered by a half step, its quality becomes minor. So this F to A, that's a major third. If I lowered the top note by a half step, then it would become F to A flat, and now its quality is a minor third. So I could take the F to E that was written above as a major seventh, lower that top note by a half step. Now it becomes a minor seventh. Okay. Most of the time, that's what you're going to encounter, majors that turn into minor. But one complication we see typically at the AP level here is that I can continue to mess with this by raising a major interval by a half step or lowering a minor interval by a half step. What happens then? If a major interval is raised by a half step, it becomes augmented. If a minor interval is lowered by a half step, it becomes diminished. So we need to add to our list of qualities here. We can get minor, we can get augmented, and we can get diminished. These are the 5 qualities of intervals. So it's not enough just to take its generic measurement. It's a fourth, it's a sixth. You have to add into your description of it one of these 5 types of qualities. So let me give you an example here. Let's take a major sixth from our example in F major here. So that would be F to D is the major sixth. If I were to raise the top note by a half step, I would get that, meaning that this is an augmented sixth. If I were to lower that half note of the major interval, I'd get a D flat up here. Now I'd get a minor sixth. If I were to lower that again by another half step, the minor interval lowered again, I would get F to D double flat, and that is called a diminished sixth. Now, I understand that D double flat is really just C. So sometimes I get asked, well, why can't we just call it a perfect fifth then? Well, if I were to play it on the piano and ask you to identify it by hearing, you'd probably call it a perfect fifth. But in written theory, how things are written matters. And any kind of F to any kind of D is generically a sixth. And then we assess the quality based on the accidentals. So I could have the major sixth up here, F to D, and then any of these other ones here. Raise the top note by a half step, lower the top note by a half step, and lower it again. Keeping in mind that raising things by a half step can mean going natural to sharp. It could mean going flat to natural. It doesn't always just mean add a sharp sign. Okay, let's talk over here about what happens if I start messing with perfect intervals. So let me rewrite this over here so you can see it better. A perfect interval, if it gets raised by a half step, it becomes augmented. If it gets lowered by a half step, it becomes diminished. So I can take any of the perfect intervals from up top, where we did all the intervals of F major, and adjust them either way. So F to C, perfect fifth, like from above. F to C sharp, augmented fifth. F to C flat, diminished fifth. And you can do this with any of the perfect intervals, even the octave. So F to F, perfect octave. F to F flat, diminished octave. F to F sharp, augmented octave. So that's why even when we're talking about unisons and octaves, it's really important that you include the quality. Sometimes we just say something's in unison or they're in octaves. And in kind of, performing in ensembles, that's specific enough. But when it comes to theory, we really need to make sure that we're including the qualities in on this. One extra thing that I should mention is a special kind of interval that is called the tritone. A tritone is an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth. So let's see, we could keep this here in treble clef. G to C sharp or G to D flat is called a tritone. So if instead of labeling something augmented fourth or diminished fifth, you could label it tritone, or TT, and that would work for labeling. It's called a tritone because the distance between is 3 whole steps. From G to A is one, A to B is another, B to C sharp is another. That's why it's called a tritone. Let's see. Let's do some identification of these now. So for these questions, I rewrote the chart over here on the left. Take the generic measurement of these intervals first. Assign them a number. Then when you're trying to assess the quality, ask yourself, is the top note a member of the bottom note's major scale? If the answer is yes, you're dealing with either the green boxes here, major or perfect. If it's a second, third, sixth, or seventh, it's going to be major. If it's a unison, fourth, fifth, or octave, it's going to be perfect. If it's not, if the top note is not a member of the bottom note's major scale, ask yourself how it has been altered from what the note in the major scale would have been. If it's been lowered or raised, and by how much. Okay, a couple of examples. E flat to G. Generically, E flat to G is a third. So now I want to know, is G a member of the E flat major scale? And because I know my major scales, I know that it is. So that means, and because it's a third, that means this is a major third. Take the generic measurement first, then assign the quality. Second example, G to D is generically a fifth. Is D sharp a member of the G major scale? No, it is not. G has one sharp, it's F sharp. Okay, if D sharp isn't the fifth note of G major, what is? What is the fifth note of G major? It's D natural. Okay, so if it was D natural, I would have had a perfect fifth. I have D sharp, so that means it's been raised by a half step. So that means I have an augmented fifth. Augmented fifth. Oh, I should just give you a little sidebar here that you can label augmented capital A or a plus sign. You can label diminished as lowercase letter d or this little degree sign. Either one for now will work for your labeling, and you should be prepared to see either one of them. Okay, there's 10 examples here. Might take you a minute, a little complicated, but if you want to pause the video and try to do these on your own, then I can go over them and explain them. Number 1, generically F to D is going to be a sixth. Is D flat a member of the F major scale? Nope. D natural would be. So if it was D, it would be a major sixth. I have D flat, which means it's been lowered by a half step. So minor sixth. Number 2, E flat to A double flat. Okay, generic first. E to A is a fourth, counting E as 1. Is A double flat a member of the E flat major scale? Well, no, there's no double flats in any major scale. So what would be? A flat would be the fourth note of E flat major. I don't have A flat. I have A double flat, meaning the A flat was lowered by a half step. So when I lower the top note of a perfect interval by a half step, it becomes diminished. There is no such thing as a minor fourth. Look at that chart. If I start with a perfect fourth and lower, it becomes diminished, does not become minor. No such thing as a minor fourth, unison, fifth, or octave. Just like there's no such thing as a perfect second, third, sixth, or seventh. You have to know which number you're dealing with and which of these two charts that I wrote that you're dealing with. Number 3, A to B flat is generically a second. B flat is not a member of A natural. B natural is. I have B flat, which means the top note's been lowered by a half step. Minor second. F to E sharp, generically is going to be a seventh. F to E would be the major seventh. And F to E sharp means that it's been raised by a half step. So this is an augmented seventh. Bass clef. Any kind of B to any kind of B is an octave. All right, well, obviously it's not B to B, so it's not a perfect octave. B flat's not in the B scale. B is B natural. So if the top note of a perfect interval has been lowered by a half step, it becomes diminished. Number 6, A flat to E flat generically is a fifth. Is E flat a member of A flat? It is, so perfect fifth. Number 7, E to G double sharp. Well, E to G, notice how they're space there? That means it's going to be a third. G sharp's not a member of E. That doesn't make sense. Or G double sharp isn't, but G sharp is. So the major would have been G sharp. I have G double sharp, which means the major was raised by a half step, so it's augmented third. Number 8, B to G flat generically is a sixth. Is G flat in the B scale? No, B is a very sharp scale. It has G sharp in it. Okay, so the major sixth would be G sharp. I don't have that. I have G flat. So if I lowered it by a half step, G sharp down to G natural, that would give me the minor sixth. It's been lowered again down to G flat, diminished sixth. See how the major has been lowered twice. G sharp would be the major. It gets lowered once. It's G natural. It gets lowered again. The G flat that we have, so it's diminished six. Number 9, D to F is generically a third. F is not in the D scale. F sharp is. So to get from F sharp to F natural, we've lowered by a half step, meaning this is a minor third. C to A flat is number 10. It's generically a sixth. A flat is not in C major. A natural is. We have A flat, which means the top note of this interval has been lowered by a half step, giving us a minor sixth. Okay, that was a lot of information in that one. So in this video, we just talked about how to identify these. So in subsequent interval videos, we'll talk about how to write them. Like if I gave you an E and said, write a minor seventh, what the process is for writing them. And then in another video, we'll talk about interval inversions. So stay tuned for those.